Hi guys, it's Ray here from City Fan TV, and in the house we have Colin Savage tonight, finance guru extraordinaire, and a nice wear of a Manchester City shirt as well, may I add, Colin. How are you doing tonight?
I'm all right. Yeah. So it's not as up to date as yours, Ray, but I love this shirt. And the interesting thing was when I first saw the pictures of it, I thought that's horrible. That really is horrible. Then I actually got invited to a preview just before the shop opened, selling the official launch of the kit, and I saw it, and saw it in real life, and I thought, wow, well, it's a great kit.
Yeah.
So I got one.
Well, I'm going to have to tell my story. I told Colin off air, I got that shirt as well, and I wore it for less than an hour on a live stream or a video I made. Then my lad, who's now he's just turned 13, he's as tall as me, certainly not as wide as me, but he nicked it straight away. So he's at that age where he's nicking my stuff, and I don't mind if it's old stuff from the, dare I say, 70s or 80s, but when he's nicking new stuff, I'm not so keen on that. Well, obviously we've got Colin in the house. We're going to talk finances again, and we're going to try and go through more on player transfers, and we're going to go through 4 different topics. And the first one is going to be net spend, what we think about it as finance people. The second is looking at the actual cost of players and whether you should look at the headline figure or not. Spoiler alert, you shouldn't. Number 3, we're going to talk about whether it's worthwhile to sell a player a little bit cheaper than what it's actually worth, or to actually pay some of his salary. And finally, we're going to look at free transfers to see if they're actually free. So, without further ado, let's get into this. Net spend, Colin. I certainly deride it on social media, and most, if not all, finance people I know want nothing to do with it. So, can you briefly tell us what net spend is and why it's actually useless in terms of finance?
I think we've got to swap the order around a little bit, because to understand why net spend is a bit of a nonsense, you've got to understand how clubs account for players and what goes through the books. And I think that helps to explain why net spend is a bit of a nonsense. So people talk about net spend. Net spend is obviously transfer fees that one club pays out compared to fees they get in for players they've sold. So it's a relatively easy method to look at expenditure, but like all stats, it can be very misleading. And why it's misleading, I think, to take point 2 first, how do you account for players? So what's the kind of financial key performance indicators, if you like, about looking at players? And number 1 is the fee. So we'll ignore the kind of complexities that we're going to come to in a minute. Let's take a fee. So we buy a player for 50 million. That's not 50 million in the profit and loss account. What we do, as we do with in accountancy, anyone knows with accounting, with a fixed asset, and players are basically fixed assets. They're known as intangible assets, and in fact, it's the contract we're valuing, not the player itself. Because people often ask, this player's gone up in value. Why is his value still the same? Well, it's the contract that we're valuing that goes into the books. So if we buy a player for £50 million and we offer him a 5-year contract, we spread the cost of that fee out over the contract, the life of the contract. So 50 million, 5 years, his expense, that is 10 million a year. That's what goes in the profit and loss account. So we're showing an expense. You can compare it to depreciation. You buy a car, you depreciate it over 5 years. Basically, you're writing down the value of that player. So that £50 million player is actually only 10 million in year 1. Doesn't matter how you pay the fee as well. That's another thing people get confused about. If you pay it in installments, if you pay it all up front, if you borrow the money, whatever, it doesn't matter. That 50 million, it goes through at 10 million a year. You might pay it to installments of 25 million. That makes no difference specifically to how the player looks in the books. So we've got 10 million a year going through, and we've also got wages. So let's say we pay him 200k a week, for the sake of argument, use the numbers. That's 10 million a year. So that player's costing us 20 million a year. So let's say, we buy a player for 50 million, we sell one for 20 million. The net spend gurus, the net spend adherents will say that's a negative net spend of 30 million. Actually, no, because well, there's a number of things going on. One is he's only going through the books at 20 million for that first year, and we've got 20 million in to balance that expenditure off from the player we've sold. And we also got rid of the wages of the players we've sold. So people always forget that in the equation. I think I compared it in another video we did to an iceberg, where you see the fees as the tip of the iceberg above the water, but below the waterline there's a lot going on. And it's things like fees, wages that people don't see. So that's one reason why net spend is a bit nonsensical. And the other reason is that 20 million player we sold, if he's come from the academy and he's cost us nothing, or we've picked him up as a youngster, we've maybe paid £100,000, as I think we did for Kelechi in Nacho, that £20 million is pure profit. And again, something else people don't quite understand is, let's take the case of, again, we bought a player for 50 million, 3 years later we're selling him for 20 million. People will say, oh, we lost 30 million on that player, but actually we didn't. Because as we say, we write him down at 10 million a year. So we knock that off the value of the contract every year. So cost us 50 million. A year later, we knock off 10 million. It's worth in the books 40 million. No correlation to what he might be worth in the transfer market, and it's not meant to be. The next year is worth 30 million. The next year is worth 20 million. So if we sell a player that we've had for 3 years, we bought for 50 million on a 5-year contract, we sell him for 20 million. Actually, we've broken even. If we leave it another year and sell him for 20 million, we've actually made a profit. So it's a whole different way of looking at the way we buy and sell players. So people have got to get out of this idea about net spend being the sole judge. Net spend is about a movement of cash, and it's not even necessarily a movement of cash, because that player we spent 50 million on, we might say have done it by paying 20 million down this year, 20 million next year, and then 10 million 18 months away. So actually the movement of cash, we've got 20 million cash we've sold, the movement of cash is nil. So that's a reason why you've got to be very careful with net spend, because all it looks at is a headline figure which doesn't represent either the accounting treatment or the kind of reality of the cash flow.
And in general, let's be honest, I had a discussion with somebody yesterday about, and they said, well, most pundits and most football people talk about net spend, but accountants don't. I think that's the key. The people that actually matter are the accountants. And we don't talk about net spend as a key performance indicator or anything, really. I think that's
well, that's right. I mean, if you run a business and you go out and buy a new car, and you trade your car in for £5,000, and you pay 25 grand for your new car, it's not a net spend of 20 grand. All right, you may have put 20 grand cash in, you may have financed that 20k over 4 years. But once you get rid of a car which was valued at 5k, potentially, or it might be less or more, and you replace it with a car that was valued at 25k.
Yeah, the new car is still valued at 25k.
And your new car still, and this is another good reason when, another example I've used, if, let's say, and it's an example from my accountancy past actually, business run by 2 partners. It was a very successful business, very simple, very successful business. It generated a lot of cash with very few expenses. And they, in the days before personal contract purchase, we're going back a long way, we just graduated from abacuses. When kind of car leasing arrangements weren't as common as they are now, car financing arrangements, they went out and bought a couple of Rolls Royces, a Rolls Royce each. And the way things work and the way Rolls don't really depreciate over the short term, but by swapping those regularly, they could basically make money on the deal. So they get more. You could sell the old car for more than they got for the new one. But let's take an example. Let's say those 2 partners both got a Rolls Royce on day one. One swaps it a year later, but the other doesn't. So the other basically keeps his for 20 years, while the other partner swaps his every year for 20 years. At the end of 20 years, the rolls is getting a bit dilapidated, getting a bit run down, and the partner who's kept it for 20 years goes into the showroom and wants to swap it. And the two of them go together. So the other guy's been there every year. They both come out with an identical Rolls Royce. The guy who's got the dilapidated 20-year-old one obviously doesn't get as much for his as his partner gets. So his net spend in that situation is higher, because maybe he's 15 grand for his Rolls and he's paying 100 grand for a new one, whereas the other guy is getting 98 grand for his old Rolls and paying 100 grand for the new one, whatever. But they've come out with a car of the same value and the same running costs. To finance it the same way, it will cost them the same, despite the partner A's only put 2 grand in, partner B's put 85 grand in or something.
Yeah. And it actually might work out that over the course of the 20 years, it's actually costing the same. It's very simple.
Potentially, yeah. Through depreciation, yeah, potentially.
So let's move on to the headline was the cost of the play. So can you just go through? I've written 4 things, and I can easily forget something. It's easy to miss things out. But what are the 4 main things that you would consider to be the cost of the player, and how is it treated in the books?
Well, right. Obviously, the fee is one. So we've taken that, and wages. So I think we've said before, when you're looking at the cost of a player, you've got to look at the total cost of ownership. In the same way, if you buy a car and it costs you money to service that car, maintain it, and you put petrol in it, or you charge it with electricity, whatever. The same as the cost of buying a house. You buy a house, you pay council tax, you pay gas and electricity. You've got to look at the total cost. You pay your mortgage. You've got to look at the total cost of owning that house. Not just the capital cost. It's all the incidental costs that come with it every month.
What about your solicitor's fees?
So?
If you're buying a house, you've got solicitor's fees. So you add it's like an agent's fee. That's why that's my analogy.
So the other things you've got to pay when you buy a house for 250k, you might pay stamp duty on that of whatever it is, 5% or whatever. So another 125k. You'll be paying estate agents' fees. You might be paying survey fees, or there's all sorts of things you might be paying. And it's no different with a player. So we said the fee. You've got to think about the wages, number 2. There'll be an agent fee, presumably, number 3. An agent's, they'll probably take a percentage of the transfer. It's a very kind of murky area, but, the ideal is an agent takes, let's say, 10% of the transfer fee. So if you buy a player for 50 million, there's another 5 million cost you pay the agent. The player should pay him something as well, but let's keep it fairly simple. And then there's perhaps all sorts of signing on fees. So, and this is where it gets confusing, because, again, what people don't realise is, even if it's a free transfer, there will be fees involved. So people talk about a free transfer. So let's take James Milner, for example, who ran down his contract at City and went to Liverpool. And that was seen as a free transfer. But James Milner got a signing on fee, I think, of something like £10 million, which is probably, when you think we paid about 24 million for Milner on a 5-year contract, that 10 million was basically the equivalent of buying him at the end of 3 years, if that makes sense. So basically you run down 20, let's say a 25 million contract, you run it down over 3 years, 5 million a year. He's worth 10 million at the end of year 3. So that's what his contract's worth. So Liverpool actually paid a fee for Milner. They just paid it to James Milner instead of paying it to City. And of course, they're still paying him wages. And the great thing about a free transfer is you can spread the cost over the wages. So let's say that the 10 million example, if you did pay the 10 million, you could perhaps pay him an extra 2 million a year, 40k a week. So instead of paying him 150k, you might pay him 190k a week. So again, this is why you've got to be very careful about assessing the cost of a player. So that Milner free wasn't a free. And another way is the Sanchez-Mkhitaryan swap between United and Arsenal. Now, Sanchez was seen as a more valuable commodity than Mkhitaryan. I think Mkhitaryan was the better player, actually. And I'm so glad United didn't get the best out of him. But again, that has to go through the books. So people talked about, they got Sanchez on a free. Well, it wasn't a free because there's got to be an adjustment in the books. So you've got to put Sanchez in at what his worth was. So basically, it's a notional contract. So I think, I can't remember the exact figures, but I think, did they pay 30 million or something, or 40 million plus Mkhitaryan, something like that. But Mkhitaryan is valued at something in the books, in United's books. Let's say he was in the books at 30 million. So basically, they're paying 70 million for Sanchez, and Arsenal are paying 30 million for Mkhitaryan, but that 30 million is netted off. So it's a net 40 million, but it's still a 70 million pound transaction.
Yeah.
On the book.
I mean, the way the numbers are done, it reminds me of the Danilo Cancelo deal, because we bought Joao Cancelo for 60 million quid, let's say. He weren't worth 60 million quid. We sold Danilo, I think, for 36 million quid. And Danilo weren't worth 36 million quid. But I think it was done so that Juventus could get enough profit in their accounts on the sale of Cancelo to make their books balance. And they were very happy to do it. And then we were happy to do it the other way because we got a huge profit in the books on the sale of Danilo. Yeah.
Which is why you shouldn't look at the headline figure. And I think the other thing is, one of the other things is, in a fee, it might be with add-ons. So Raheem Sterling, for example, was 44 million base fee plus 5 million add-ons if certain criteria are achieved. Now, the way that's accounted for is, accounting tends to be a very prudent profession. So you don't put the full cost through the books unless you're sure you're going to pay that. So we certainly put, but so what you would probably do is, if there was a bonus which you were 95% certain would be met, you'd probably include that in the overall contract price, but the rest you'd hold back as what they call contingent liability. So it's something you may pay in the future if certain conditions met. But if you're pretty sure, if one of the conditions is we'll pay you $1 million when he's played 10 games, first team starts, you're pretty sure he's going to meet that condition. So, instead of 44 million, it'll be 45 million you're putting through the books. But the other 3 million, which might be winning a Premier League, winning a Champions League, you'd hold those back until they were actually achieved, if they were. Well, they were. Part of it was for Sterling.
Yeah. The last point then, obviously, we've done it different to my order, but I think it's in a more sensible way. It's just why it's worthwhile sometimes to sell a player cheaper or less value than what the market rate could be, or other, as us as fans think it should be, or why it's worth paying someone or part of someone's wages whilst they're playing for another club. That's happened with Sanchez. It's happened with some of our players in the first few years. So why is it worth, when you're, as I said, selling a player, why is it worth to sometimes do a quick deal at less than the value that you could have attained if you'd hung out like Daniel Levy right to the last minute?
Well, there's two questions there, really. The first one is, why would you do a quick deal at less than market value? And I think we talked previously about Angelino. And people were talking about potentially Eric Garcia. Eric Garcia is a good example because he's entering the last year of his contract. So if we don't do a deal for him this summer, he leaves for nothing next summer. Although summer's nearly gone now, but if we don't do a deal for him this window, he can leave next summer for nothing. So as we just talked about, if we do a deal for him now, it's profit. Don't think we paid very much for him. And if we sell him, he's been with us for a while. So his value on the books, I'm not sure what it is, but his value on the books is pretty negligible, I would say. It's probably only a few million quid. If we can sell him for 18 million quid, we show profit in the books of 14 million. If it's on the books at 4 million, we sell it for 18, we show a profit of 14 million. And we get a fee. So sometimes it's better to take the profit now and perhaps lose a bit on the fee, because you can put it through the books. You can put it through the books earlier. If we take Garcia, for example, people talk about Garcia being worth 25 million euros or whatever. Maybe we'll get 15 million for him. If you leave next summer, we get nothing. If we sell him this window, we're showing a profit of, I would imagine, pretty well close to 15 million. And again, as we said, that 15 million, both in cash terms and in profit terms, on the profit and loss account, that funds a purchase. So if you just take it as the most simplistic, we show profit of 15 million. That potentially funds the buying of Koulibaly. Let's say we're paying 70 million for him. We'd amortize that, or let's say 75 million. Makes it a nice round figure. On a 5-year contract, 15 million a year goes in the books. And we're showing a 15 million profit. So basically, you've written off the first year's amortization on Koulibaly. Also, you've got rid of a wage. I'm sure Koulibaly would be on a higher wage than Garcia, for example. But you've got rid of let's say Garcia's on 50k a week and Koulibaly's on 120k a week. Basically, you're only paying Koulibaly 70k a week net because you've got rid of Garcia's money. And you've got his first year's transfer fee amortization for nothing. So it might cost us 75 million euros or pounds or whatever, but actually it's cost us, what did we say? 70, no, 50, 70.
Maybe 3.5 million?
What's about 3.5 million, yeah, in that first year. Yeah, it's late at night.
I've got to say, and in my defence,
I haven't got my abacus out.
in my defence, I was on mute and I said it straight away, and it came up. Yes. Get yourself off mute. So yeah, 3.5.
So yeah, and it's about, and it's all about this. So it's thinking about the total cost of a player. There's some cash coming in. There's a profit. We're showing the profit and loss accounts. We get some wages off the books, and brings us to the second point. Why would United pay parts of Sanchez's wages? Well, because they're not paying the other part. So if he's getting 400k a week and they're paying 200k, that's 10 million a year they've released, basically. So don't think of it in terms of they're still paying 10 million. All right, he's not playing for them. They get no value from him, but they've got 10 million of value effectively they can use for someone else.
Yeah. Now that we're talking, there's another thing that I'm going to throw out there that I don't think people are considering, and it is to do with selling players maybe a bit cheaper than they're actually worth, and it's the COVID situation. Now, if you look at some clubs, they're taking a huge hit. Man United have taken one of the biggest without having any fans there, and it's going to cost them, if there are no fans for a full season, between 120 and 140 million quid. It's going to cost City, if we have no fans this season, somewhere in the region of 55 to 60 million quid, because I think we get about 55 million pounds income on match days. Liverpool, obviously, they have a similar crowd, but they charge their fans a lot more than City do, because we're still a working man's club, and they charge a lot more. So they get somewhere in the region of, let's say, 70 to 80 million or even 90 million pounds as match day income. City are only getting about 55. The numbers might be slightly wrong, but Liverpool are getting a lot more for a similar sized crowd. So if you're suddenly faced with the prospect, we don't know when fans are going to go back. It looks like it's going to be delayed. We don't know how many fans are going to go back. It looks like it could be down to 15 or 20, maybe 30%. So clubs, let's use, obviously City is our club. Let's say we earn about 50 million a year. If we only have 30% of the fans there, for argument's sake, we might only earn 15 million pounds. And if there is a delay, looks like there's going to be a delay, we might only get 10 million pounds match day. We might only get 10 million pounds of match day income this year, or 50 million quid. We're 40 million pounds short. So we have to, if we're trying to break even, or we're trying to be self-sustaining, we have to make up that 40 million. It might just be who knows? Maybe we're panicking a bit and say we have to get rid of a couple of players. We'll have to sell them cheap and just to move them on. In the same way, Liverpool aren't spending much money this summer because of the COVID situation. People have to take that into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. Clubs work on a budget, despite what Herr Klopp says. We work on a budget as much as Liverpool work on a budget. We have to take FFP into account, of course. And actually, there's another revenue factor which has sort of been overlooked a little bit, which will cost clubs some money from this coming season. Is the Premier League have cancelled the Chinese TV contract, which was bringing in over £500 million a year. So divide that by 20, and that's 25 million straight. But
it's not per season, is it? I think it works out about 9 million a season, 9 or 10 million.
So again, but you've got to remember, clubs work to a budget. I mean, both City and Liverpool. We had the discussion. We were talking about Klopp's comments. In the profit and loss account, they're running break even. City reported a 22 million operating loss before transfer profits were taken into account. Liverpool pretty well broke even, very small £500,000 profit before transfer profits were added in, which is why, again, showing a transfer profit is important, because most clubs run at probably a slight loss or break even. There's probably very few clubs, particularly in the Premier League, who make a huge operating profit. So, any hit is magnified by, we don't have a lot of fat to burn when times are a bit lean. So again, it could be important to get some money in for a player. Selling players could be a way, of supplementing income. Now, City, our match day revenue is only about 10% of our total revenue, but I think Spurs, someone said, their projected match day revenue was like 40% of their total revenue. United, I think, is about 20%. Liverpool, about 18%. Liverpool's about 15%. Arsenal's is quite high, I think, about 20%. So the hit to them will be much greater. And there isn't as much money around. And so I was saying, why are we selling someone for less than market value? Well, the market is changed, as you say. COVID has changed things. There is less money. Perhaps teams are more desperate to sell, and other teams can't pay out the sort of money that they might have paid out 2 years ago.
Yeah, we've seen people like Barcelona struggling. The rumours are Inter is struggling. For instance, they had this chap called Tonali that they were supposed to be buying, and it never happened. And then suddenly AC Milan came along. He went there. He's a AC Milan fan. But the rumour came out afterwards that actually Inter couldn't afford the purchase. And you hear the rumours of Barcelona with their huge debts. They want Lautaro Martinez, but why haven't they put a bid in for him? It's getting quite late. And there's things like that. So, there are these dominoes waiting to fall. But if Barcelona can't afford to pay the 80 million for Lautaro Martinez, then Inter are going to end up, might be a bit strapped for cash. And I suggested before that City just go in there and say, look, here's 50 million. We know you're strapped for cash. And, they might go for it, because we don't know the finances of other clubs.
Yeah. As we said, the cash could be as important as anything else. Yeah. So, and the transfer market is a merry-go-round. So, we pay 70 million for Koulibaly. Napoli use that money to go and buy someone else. And the club they buy someone else off goes and uses that money. And some of it disappears in agent fees, of course, and one or two other things. But if there's less money, if there's less money going around, clearly fees are going to go down.
Absolutely.
So, we say it could be just important if you're if you run a business, you sell a commodity, whatever it is, whether it's TVs or three-piece tees or clothes or anything, any commodity, you've only got a limited amount of space to store that stuff. So if you want to get new stuff in, which is higher margin, you've got to get rid of the old stuff, and that might involve selling it at a price that you think is below market value, which is why, of course, we have sales every January, companies have got a load of stock in for Christmas, but they're stuck with a load of stuff. They've got to restock. They want the old Christmas stuff out the door, so they'll sell it and sell it cheap.
Unless
and
you
it's the
DFS.
same with the transfer market.
Unless you DFS and your sale goes on all year round. I don't know how they manage that.
DFS. But yeah, the transfer market is a cash merry-go-round. And if there's less cash going in, there's less cash going round on the roundabout.
Fantastic. I think that's our time for today. But once again, guys, I want to say a big thank you to Colin for explaining different elements of transfer, purchases and sales, and why clubs might be doing things that they're doing when the fans looking from the outside question what's going on. And hopefully we've given you a bit of an insight into all that. So a massive thanks again to you, Colin.
It's always nice to try and educate people.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.